Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. The House of Commons and the Senate are both gone for the summer, and they managed to pass 14 non-budget related or estimates related bills, which is practically a record for how this government has been operating lately. Considering how in the previous sitting they managed to hold two bills that were not money related. And nevertheless, they could have actually passed more. And this is a particular bugaboo of mine, which is that since the changes in the Senate to make them more independent, we've had a succession of government leaders in the Senate who refuse to sit any later than the House of Commons. And this actually used to be fairly routine back in the day, the old partisan days in the Senate, where they would sit a week, sometimes even two, after the House of Commons would rise, so that they could get more work done. And why that's especially more relevant right now is because thanks to the problems that have come in with hybrid sittings, and the problems with the strain on interpretation staff and the fact that we are lacking enough interpreters now to have enough on staff to do all of the both chambers and committees operating at all times. They simply can't do that anymore. The Senate actually had an opportunity to use the fact that the House of Commons was gone and all of those interpreters were available to actually do some more work in the public eye. And they didn't. And there are four bills that were on their order paper that I just kind of wanted to walk through a little bit because some of them are pretty important and they could have been passed had they bothered to sit the next week or two, like they used to back, 7 or 8 years ago. And so I figured I'd go through those. Two of the bills had just arrived at the Senate before they left, so they're still at second reading stage. And two of them had already been advanced to committee, and they would have had the opportunity to have some fairly high-profile committee sittings on both of those. So the first bill, which is so the two that just arrived before summer and haven't had second reading debate yet, were the framework, so Bill C-35, which is the framework legislation for early learning and childcare. So what this is so that the government already made all these bilateral deals with each of the provinces and territories around the early learning and childcare system so that, they would get to the $10 a day childcare in a certain number of years. Most provinces have long since accelerated that timeline. But there was a concern, particularly from the NDP, that unless this was in legislation, it would be too easy to cancel these deals. That's actually kind of naive because legislation cannot bind a future government. So if the next government comes in and they want to eliminate these deals, they can do so with the same legislative power that it took to pass this particular bill. It's just a bit of a speed bump. So that rationale doesn't really hold. Nevertheless, symbolically speaking, this is about the commitment to this early learning and childcare system on going forward. And the Conservatives did vote for this at third reading in the House of Commons, which seems to be a sign that they are getting the message from Canadians that this is an important program for them. So this bill could have been debated. It could have gone to committee. It could have heard witnesses within those couple of weeks. They didn't. The other one, though, Bill C-42, which is amendments to the Canada Business Corporations Act, is actually really, really important because this is the federal government imposing disclosure obligations on beneficial ownership. That means that if you've got a numbered corporation, it forces you to disclose who owns that numbered corporation. Because we see a lot of companies who use shell companies or numbered corporations to hide who the owners of these assets are. And this is especially important in the environment we are in when it comes to things like sanctions. We have imposed a whackload of sanctions on Russian oligarchs, people related to the Iranian regime, certain members of the Chinese regime. These are all important, and some of them like to hide assets in these numbered corporations scattered around the globe. And this is a first step for Canada to force disclosure of who that ownership is. Now, this would only apply to federal corporations, and all the provinces would need to come up with their own beneficial ownership registries. But this would be a kick in the ass for those provinces to get their own legislation in order, because the federal one would be there. It would be a good template for how provinces could structure their own. And it would help law enforcement, especially when it comes to trying to catch people who are trying to evade sanctions by using these kinds of numbered corporations. This piece of legislation, which arrived on the Senate's order paper shortly before they rose, could have been debated, could have been passed in those couple of weeks. Was not. As for the two that are at committee, one of those is the gun control bill. You know, the one that spent 9 months at least in committee in the House of Commons, when we had the amendments that blew up and had to be withdrawn because they caused every hunter in the country to freak out and First Nations to become alarmed, and so on and so on. So that final version of the bill has finally made it to the Senate, and it's in committee. And they could have spent those couple of weeks holding some fairly high-profile committee hearings, hearing from witnesses in a far less partisan environment than it was in the House of Commons. They could have held these hearings. They could have had a lot of a national spotlight and attention on this issue because they had the undivided attention of the media. The House of Commons was gone. Government ministers are already scattered across the country. So they had the opportunity to showcase the work they do and to put a spotlight on this bill and to showcase what was in here, what they could do about it, all that kind of stuff. Again, they decided to leave early, so that didn't happen. And when they come back in the fall, and they start debating this in committee, it's going to get buried because there aren't enough resources. There aren't going to be enough interpreters to do the kind of marathon session that this kind of a bill warranted. And the media is going to be distracted with everything else under the sun because the Senate is a far lower priority for them to cover, unless there's a scandal, which this is not. So this is going to get buried in the news cycle when Parliament resumes in the fall, and they've squandered an opportunity. The final bill is on the National Council for Reconciliation Act. Again, this was the government's way of trying to come up with more accountability measures for themselves in terms of how they're going about reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. This would have provided some advisory guidance for governments going forward. It would have helped hold them to account for the actions that they have taken so far. This probably could have been fairly straightforward in committee and passed with not a lot of difficulty. The Senate has also got a lot of Indigenous representation in it, so there would have been some really good debate happening over this because they've got such a diverse Indigenous representation in the Senate. And again, they had the couple of weeks they could have done this. They could have had some spotlight on this, and they didn't. So those are 4 particularly important pieces of legislation that could have been passed by now. And I have heard senators say, well, it doesn't make sense for us to sit when the House of Commons isn't sitting, because if we've got amendments, then then they can't deal with them. But they can deal with them in the fall just as well. So that's not a real argument, because it's not like they need constant back and forth communication. If they decide bills need amending and send them back, then that can be the first thing the House of Commons deals with when they come back in September. This shouldn't be shouldn't be rocket science. They should have managed to sit another week, possibly two, get these bills done, and had a little spotlight on them when they did it, because they're always complaining that nobody pays enough attention to the Senate. There was the opportunity for people to pay attention to them, and they decided to squander it. So this, like I said, is kind of a bugaboo of mine. This should have been an easy win for the Senate. It should have been an easy win, and they decided not to take it. So, this should be a problem for the leadership in the Senate that they should want to address. But I don't see enough appetite for that. And that's kind of a problem for them. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.